For an engineer, the most interesting thing about a machine is like getting it to work. For a scientist, the most interesting thing about the machine is like, when does it fail and what does it do when it fails? Because that's the edge, right? That's where you're on the edge between what we understand and what we don't understand, where you see the machine and it works really well for doing some things. But then the situations where it doesn't work, the situations where it can't tell a pig from a dog, like, what is it doing? What happens there? Like, that's where you can really understand something about how the machine actually works.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
I gotta say, like, I don't think you want to do stuff like this when you've been like listening to your own voice for like 7 hours straight and like are exhausted kind of listening to self-talk. You know what I mean? It's
yeah.
I don't know if you've
I had sections in a book that I read an audiobook for before, and it was so small that it was like 4 to 6 hours of work. So it wasn't it wasn't bad. I got off easy, but yeah, I imagine a whole book, especially one like yours, which is especially long, and that would be something I wouldn't look forward to. But I will say that I'm happy that you read your own audiobook, because it kind of drives me crazy. Unless someone has like a super annoying voice or something like that, I actually hate when people get a professional, someone to professionally read their audiobook, because it's always way too much for me. I remember I was reading, I think it was, I want to say it was like Black Swan or something like that, or I think it was the guy that wrote that Anti-Fragile book or whatever.
Nicholas Taleb.
Yeah, I think it was one of his earlier books before that. Anyway, whichever one it was, and I think it was his. I'm listening, and I listened to the whole thing, but whoever he had reading it really took some liberties, and he was like, when there is why, and every time there was a WH sound, he did that, and it was intense, and it was like barely tolerable. An otherwise very interesting book.
You think that in the modern era, that would be a knob that you, the audiobook listener, could be like, I want this in an Australian accent. You should just be able to like turn that feature on, like the Siri, have the book however you like. I don't want any of the voiced WHs. I just want it to sound like a W. Bang, you should be able to filter that.
But it's like, I think like Dan Ariely has someone else do his, like Robert Sapolsky's had someone else do, like all these people that have these fantastic voices and like great ways of delivering things have had other people. So I'm glad that you did it. I'm also sorry.
You want to know why I did it? There's two reasons. There's really two reasons if you want to know the truth. One is that, my books tend to have a lot of pictures. And so you got to kind of explain around the picture a little bit. And that's hard to do if you didn't write the book. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
An actor doing it wouldn't really know what to say to kind of work around the picture. But the other thing, to be honest, is I don't know if you know this, but Nirvana originally recorded in Madison. The first version of Nevermind was recorded here. Most of it is not what they used for the final album, but they recorded here at Smart Studios, and that studio was available. I was like, how could I not do it? Come on.
That's so cool. Nirvana was my first love. Actually, Weird Al was my first love, and
that was your gateway.
And then Weird Al's parody of Smells Like Teen Spirit, that was the first time where I was like, oh, I actually like this music. What is this? And then I looked into it, and then I got into Nirvana, and I was a huge, still am a huge Nirvana fan. Well, I might keep all this. This is a fun conversation already. So that was, let's just get into it if you don't mind. You want to?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. Yeah. All right. Well, great, everybody. You just got to listen into us chattering a little bit beforehand, but welcome to the Here We Are podcast. I'm Shane Mauss, and my guest today, Jordan Ellenberg, is the author of Shape, The hidden geometry of information, biology, strategy, democracy, and everything else. It's fantastic. I haven't put this off a week. I started it. Listeners, usually, I'm very honest with my listeners, and I tell them if I've read the book or not. And COVID, I haven't been reading hardly at all. It's like the least I've read in 10 years, and other than papers and stuff. And usually I can do about the first 3 chapters of like a pop science book, and then I can skim the rest, and that's enough to BS my way through interview. And I started reading yours, and I was like, I don't think that I can BS my way through this one without reading more. And I was really hoping to get all the way through it, and I'm like 5/8 of the way through this fantastic book. But thanks for joining me, Jordan.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be on.
Can you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. I mean, I'm a mathematician. That's my job. That is a job. I don't know if everybody knows that is still a thing that you can be if you're not like a dead Greek individual in a robe or something like that. But no, it is still a thing. There are a decent number of us. I mean, probably, numbered. How many mathematicians are there in the US? I don't know, 10,000, like 20,000. Like certainly most of us, a lot of us are college professors like me. So I teach at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I'm coming to you from right now. Some people work for the government in various capacities. A lot work for corporations. A lot of people nowadays work in tech and machine learning and things like that, right? There's mathematicians all over the place.
How would you calculate something like that? Would you take a sample size of an area and then expand?
Right, put a little cordon around it and see how many mathematicians cross the boundary in a certain amount of time. I'd probably do something real lazy, like find out how many members the American Math Society has, and then figure it's probably about half. About half of us. No, I mean, but we do stuff like that all the time. Like if I were to literally look up the membership of the American Math Society, I'd figure that's probably more than 1 in 10 mathematicians, and it's probably not 90% of all mathematicians. So already that gives me a range, probably allows me to get the number of digits right in that number of people who would call themselves mathematicians.
Right. And so your book Shape, this is, what number book is this for you?
This is, it depends how you count. If you count, I used to want to be a novelist. So if you count back when I was trying to make it in the world of literature, then it's my 3rd book. If you count only the books that any number of people have actually read, then it would be my 2nd book. If you don't count my earlier literary production.
What was your first one called again?
It was called The Grasshopper King. I wrote it when I was a very young person. I know we're still young, but it was even younger than now.
Oh, your first. What was your last book that people actually read?
The one anybody bought. Yeah, that was called How Not to Be Wrong. That came out 7 years
ago. Do you mind giving me just a little summary of that?
Sure. I mean, How Not to Be Wrong. It was the first book of this kind I wrote where I just really tried to put everything in it. When you're a mathematician, you just kind of go through life sort of seeing things a certain way, and you're like, oh, I wish I could explain this my way. You know what I mean? Not that it's a better way. It's just a different way. We have kind of a different way of seeing things. And I was able to kind of get a lot of that into that book, a lot of stuff that I'd had stored up, just trying to emphasize what does the world look like through a mathematical lens. And talking about, I mean, some of it is deep and philosophical. Some of it is political. Some of it is just very everyday stuff. We talked about when you should miss your plane, how often you should miss your plane at the airport. Where the answer is not never, right?
So once in a while, it's good to miss your plane.
Well, the idea is that you make some choice. Crash. You make some choice about how early you're going to get there. And you could set that knob to be I'm going to get there 5 hours early and literally go my whole life without missing a plane. But then you're spending a lot of time in the airport. Probably too much. You're wasting too much of your life. You could set the knob to get there about a half an hour before. You'll still make your plane a lot of the time. I've done that. But that's probably missing too much.
So I love this equation.
Yeah, there's some optimum, and it's not, the optimal value of something is never 0.
Mm-hmm. Because you have to calculate how much is that flight. It's a little bit different if it's something that, if it's like New York to LA and it's at a time when you're going to be able to get on the next one that's a few hours later or something like that, and
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
hungover. There's a lot of math involved there. That's getting into the drunken walk territory. And then
Yeah.
but that's a different situation than if you're catching a flight from Sydney to Boston, and the flight was $1,600 or something like that, and you don't want to screw anything up.
And you're right, absolutely. That it's not just a matter of what's the chance of missing it, right? It's like, how much do you not want to miss it? And that's going to be different in different situations, and it's going to be different for different flights. So all those things go into it. And, in the new book, it's fine. That was just sort of an offhand thing in the last book that kind of caught people's fancy. And in the new book, well, you saw it, I talk a lot more about optimization, this whole field of mathematics that's so crucial to all this stuff that's going on with AI and machine learning and everything. Just this sort of basic question of like, okay, there's a lot of ways I could go through life. There's a lot of choices I can make. What's my strategy for figuring out which one is best? That doesn't sound on its face like a math problem or a geometry problem, but it has a lot of geometry in it.
Yeah, I was really caught by the local Optima. That idea was something that I've been thinking about for a week now. I've mentioned it on another podcast that I have, and it's something that kind of applies to. There's a lot of life lessons in there. If you could break down a little bit, do you mind going into a little bit of that? Because there's also, I got stuck on a little bit of the AI. There was a thing that I got a little confused about. Well, we can start wherever you want. But there was a section in the AI stuff that was talking about when a 1 goes in, or when a 0.5 goes in, or if it's over 0.5, it'll spit out a 1, and if it's under 0.5, it'll spit out a 0. I got that, but then in the graph, it was showing there was like a 1 going into something, and then it put out a 3. And I was wondering why it put out a 3. I might have just been tired when I was reading it. Can you set up the section that I'm talking about a little bit? This is a little bit indulgent for me, or I don't know how long it will take you to get into this for the average listener to get up to speed, but
sure. Well, I know people usually listen to your podcast with some scratch paper, right? And like a pencil and maybe a slide rule and a protractor in hand. So everybody's ready, I assume, for us. Well, to start with, let me say this thing about this notion of the local optimum, just so people know what it is that we're talking about who are not already calculus heads, right? So, the fundamental principle of optimization, which is actually incredibly simple, but is very rarely stated when people write about artificial intelligence, is you have some strategy for doing whatever it is you're going to do. If you're a person, it's like going through life. If you're a computer, maybe it's learning to like recognize an image, or like recognize a song, or recommend a song to someone on Spotify, or whatever it may be. You have some strategy, and you want to improve it. And what you do is you look at all the very small changes you can make and try to assess what effect they'll have, see which one is best, do that, change your strategy a little tiny bit in that direction. Now you have a new strategy. Now just keep doing that. That's it. That's a procedure called gradient descent. And you may say, like, well, why are you only thinking about small changes? Why aren't you thinking about big changes? Well, because usually the effect of a small change is much easier to assess, right? It's much easier to understand, here's the thing I'm doing. I tweak it in one small way. Is that going to make my life better or worse? That's kind of thinking about every single massive change you could possibly make all at once. That's what you call kind of a computationally infeasible problem, right? That's like too large of a set of things to think about. But what that means, so what's a local optimum? Optimum means like the best. Local optimum means, I compare it in the book to like the situation of procrastinating something. Like there's something, maybe you got to like clean up some huge pile of crap in your house. And you don't want to leave it that way forever, right? You know that that's not like the situation that you want to be in. But on any given day, you're like, if I take this first step and start doing this today, is that going to make today better or worse? And the answer is always worse, right? Every single day, the answer is like, this small action is definitely going to make my life worse if I spend the next hour, facing up to the fact that my room looks like trash and I've got to like clean this stuff up, instead of whatever, distracting yourself from that fact in some way, or just doing something that is more fun or something like that. So this procrastination is kind of caused by being stuck in a local optimum where the state of having everything cleaned up and nice is actually better. You know that's like a better place to be. But to go up, to improve, you kind of have to go down and then up. You kind of have to like make your life worse for a certain period of time in order to eventually go up and get better. And that's, probably, I think that is not a concept that's foreign to people. But the fact that it's a piece of geometry is, I think, not the way people usually think of it.
Yeah. That's, I mean, I've just been thinking so much about that idea of kind of, if you're sort of blind on a forest floor and trying to find your way to the peak of a mountain, and I mean, you're not blind, it's just covered in brush and everything, and you can't see the peak, so you're just going and trying to find, and your comparison was that this is sort of what AI is doing in a lot of ways too, kind of trying to get closer to what that looks like a small improvement, so you look around for the area where it seems like you're going up, and once everywhere around you is going down, you might assume that you've reached the top of the mountain, but you might have just been on a hill. There might be a higher peak that you're actually getting to. And man, that resonates with I think a lot of aspects of life. And I'm 40 right now, and I know I have a lot of listeners like around my between like 30 and 50, like middle age ish. And then I also, there's COVID and a pandemic, and everyone's kind of reassessing things in life, and things are shaken up a little bit. And it's easy to find yourself at the top of something and then realize, oh, that's actually not the top of a thing that I want to be at necessarily. I did this with traditional stand-up early on, and then I knew I peaked, and then I knew I wanted to kind of expand more and do more thoughtful and meaningful things and pursue more of my curiosities. And then I had to really descend down into, I'm going to have to completely educate myself. It's going to take at least 5 years to do that. And I'm not going to be very fluent in science for a long time until I start talking with enough people and have read enough, and then I'll start ascending a different hill.
Now, what I wonder is, did you feel like the bigger peak was in sight? Like, did you know where you wanted to get, or did you just know it's not doing it for me where I am right now? I got to sort of strike out in some direction and see what happens.
I knew it wasn't doing it for me, and I knew traditional stand-up wasn't what I wanted to do. I started traveling internationally, and internationally people were doing one-man shows and stuff. And I was just thinking about what I kind of would want. I was like a late night comic at the time. And so I just kind of, there was a series of events where I should have been as happy as I was in Malibu and like paradise, and my career was going well, and I just had like, my dream had just come true of getting this comedy special. Just everything on the surface seemed like it was right, but it didn't feel right. And so there was a couple, I got really into evolutionary biology and psychology at the time, and that's when I was like, oh, everyone needs to hear about this. I need to completely retrain what I do so I can communicate these ideas to people on the stage.
I want to go watch your special now and see if I can see it in your eyes. See if I can be like, this guy, like everybody's laughing, but in his eyes, he's like, I'm not fulfilled by this. This is not what I want to be. Do you think it's visible, or do you think it's a professional performer?
No, I didn't know. It was a Comedy Central presents. It was in like 2009, 2010 or something like that. And I killed it. And I had the time of my life doing it. And I had an after party afterwards, and it was at the after party. I was just sitting there like, I was having a nice time and everything. Family was there, everything else, all these great friends. And I was just like, well, now what do I do? And I knew like right then and there that I needed something a little bit more. And I fooled around with things for a while. I almost, I got into like watching the news a bunch and to like, oh, maybe I'll get into politics or something like that. And oh, maybe I'll write for the Daily Show or something. There was a lot of, I just wanted to do something more meaningful than just set up punch jokes. And it led to a huge descent down. I had enough things that I could still make a living based off my past credits, but it took a long time to kind of reinvent myself. But I'm sure there's so many people going through that exact same thing right this very moment, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And at that stage of life that you talk about, I think actually that's a perfect example of like potentially the local optimum, like being inside like a career that's very focused. And I know academic mathematics is like this, and I don't know if the first thing about stand up, but I'll bet it is too, where everybody around you is doing that thing, and all the information around you is how can I go further along this path?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's like this very narrow region, and you're like, let me find the highest spot in this little region of the conceptual universe, you know. And for it's funny because for me, you could say there's even something a little bit the same in that I was not a writer. I was always writing on the side, but you know, my main job was and is being a mathematician, like doing research, proving theorems. You know, and I have found this other thing that I do, you know, writing books and like kind of going around and talking to people and kind of spreading the gospel of math. A little bit. So I think it happens to a lot of us at a certain period of our life where you're like, is there another direction I could strike off in? Now, in my case, I was able to stay doing what I'm doing. Like, so, you know, I didn't have to give up the thing I was doing. I was able to kind of add it on. But yeah, I think, and I think, you know, you brought up this thing we've all just gone through, right? This pandemic that we're, you know, knock on wood in the US, kind of like finding our way out of right now. And, you know, one of the things I talk about in the book is, you know, okay, so you diagnose the problem, you're stuck in a local optimum. Like there's better places to be, but they're far away from where you are. And the small steps you would take like wouldn't improve your life any. So like, you know, sometimes you just need a big kick, right? Sometimes you sort of need some big change, even if you don't know if it's going to make your life any better, to kind of kick you into a new region of the landscape where maybe you can find your way to the summit a little more easily. And, you know, look, it's my personality to try to like bright side things. So like maybe COVID is going to be that for a lot of people, right? I mean, this thing that we've gone through, a lot of people are like not by their own will suddenly undergoing big changes in their life and being like, oh, this way that I thought my life was just was like, there was no other option. Like now I've been doing things differently. Like, you know, maybe people see their way to a new thing.
Yeah. I think that one of the sad, you know, there's the obvious sad things of the tragedy of such a health crisis and lives lost and long-term effects and people, you know, struggling financially and everything else. But I think that one of the big things is missed opportunity for like really taking advantage of this time and exploring those things. Because I know a lot of people that have kind of reinvented themselves during this time and feel a lot better off for. I know a lot of people that are like, I'm going to kind of miss this time. I'm going to kind of miss this, like,
I don't know if I go that far.
Like the restructuring aspect of it, you know? And then there was people that just tried to make it work. There were, for example, there was comics that tried to do the distance shows and stuff like that and tried to like get by making, you know, less money doing shows than they were already doing. And then there was people that kind of reinvented what they were doing. And I don't know, I talk with a lot of people in a lot of different occupations that are kind of exploring the same thing. But
I mean, I think for those people, you know, who were lucky to not get hit directly, you know what I mean? To not get hit themselves or their family. I think people ask themselves like, what am I going to do with this luck? Right? Shouldn't I do something with it? Shouldn't I make something of it?
Yeah. And how does that apply to, can you break down how that applies to AI and how machine learning works?
Yeah, well, we got a little bit away from it, right? So, but But the fundamental point I want to make is that I think people often think of this machine learning stuff, this AI stuff, as if it's like some kind of magic, sort of some kind of wizard, like types a bunch of code onto a screen, like in Hackers or something, and like that's how it comes. But the fundamental ideas are absurdly simple, and it's actually really,
I'm
yeah,
still here.
it's oh, cool. I'm just like, yeah, me and the wall are having like a really good conversation right now. But,
I had to make a light adjustment. I'm still listening though.
Okay. That it sounds incredible, but all these machines are doing when they, like a text prediction machine on your email that's like sort of like running ahead of you and like predicting the next word you're going to say. All it's doing is building some strategy for word predicting, and it's testing it out on the insanely huge body of text that these companies, let's say it's Google, like already has stored. So they have any strategy they can think of, they can test on an absurdly huge amount of data to see like how well it works. Tweak the strategy a little bit, test it again. Tweak it a little bit, test it again. Make it better and make it better. It's sort of it's basically a process of trial and error, but like run incredibly fast because of the sort of incredible amount of processing power that they can throw at it. And you kind of think like, well, how well could that possibly work? And the answer is it works pretty well. That's that's sort of what the miracle is, that this sort of like very blind process of trial and error where you don't build in any information about like how the English language works or like what a noun is or what a verb is or what words mean. It's just purely sort of trying to train itself to do the best job predicting the past, like words that it's already seen. And having done that, it tends to do a pretty good job of predicting the future. So maybe one thing to say is that about this current state of AI is that the real mysteries aren't how to make it work, because it works pretty well. The mystery is why it works. And I think in many ways, we don't really understand that. We don't understand like why it tends to not get caught in a local optimum and sort of like be like, okay, I'm done. I made the perfect system. And then it's like complete crap. Well, okay, that does happen in certain cases, but it happens less often than it has any right to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my brother does a lot of big data stuff, and a lot of times they put in a problem and the AI solves it, and then their job is basically just trying to figure out how the hell did it do that. So let's learn what it did to figure that out and reverse engineer. Now that it has that solution, then reverse engineer how it got to that solution.
Yeah, exactly. Like, these algorithms and these strategies devised by AI, they're not like traditional computer programs where if a traditional computer program that does something, you can look at the different parts of it and see what each part is supposed to do. And if some part of it isn't working, you can sort of zero in on that part and debug it, right? And sort of find the problem. Mm-hmm. These new algorithms aren't really like that. They're not so legible. And if it's doing something funky, it's not like you can be like, oh, I see, it's the carburetor. It's not like a car. It's not easy to see if there's one individual component. That's the problem. So I always say, in some sense, I think the future of debugging, it's going to look a lot more like therapy. You know what I mean? Because it's like one big global system that clearly is doing something, and sometimes it's clearly a little bit dysfunctional and it's not working. But just like you can't like go into somebody's head and just like remove the part that's faulty and stick in another part, and then they're psychologically more healthy. No, it's going to be sort of some kind of more global approach.
Interesting. So, what's kind of the difference between how because you kind of made the point in the book that at least where AI is right now, it's not operating in the same way that a human brain is, and it's kind of there's a lot of you made a great point about what is easy and what is difficult in math, and how it's kind of just what might be like a very easy calculation for a calculator is near impossible for a human. But then there's things that are absolutely obvious to humans that a computer has the hardest time with. I just got done watching what was it? Something something versus the machines. It's new on Netflix.
Oh, the Mitchells.
The Mitchells versus the machine. Have you seen it by chance?
Yes, I watched it with my daughter. We loved it.
There was the dog pig thing where the AI is trying to figure out if it's the joke in the movie. They have this ridiculous looking pug and it's screwing up the AI because, without spoiling too much of any, this is a small aspect. The AI can't figure out if it's a dog or a pig.
Yeah, and that's like an awesome in joke about like what's called adversarial machine learning. Like it's like a topic I've seen like a million seminars about, and I was like, I can't believe they like put an adversarial machine learning joke like into like a major kids movie. But yeah, exactly. And I think, look, as a scientist, maybe here's the difference between a scientist and as an engineer, right? And for an engineer, the most interesting thing about a machine is like getting it to work. For a scientist, the most interesting thing about the machine is like, when does it fail and what does it do when it fails? Because that's the edge, right? That's where you're on the edge between what we understand and what we don't understand, where you see the machine and it works really well for doing some things. But then the situations where it doesn't work, the situations where it can't tell a pig from a dog, like, what is it doing? What happens there? Like, that's where you can really understand something about how the machine actually works.
Mm. So you break down a lot of history of geometry in the book, and normally it was so interesting to me because sometimes sometimes I'll find myself reading, say, especially I don't know, there's something about cognitive biases or something like that, and they'll be going through some whole history of what like Plato or Socrates said about this and that, and usually I'm like, oh, I don't care what they like. Anything before Darwin, like if you went back and showed any of those philosophers Darwinian thinking, they would have taken a big black marker to half the things that they said. The kind of top-down reasoning instead of this bottom-up emergence is something that kind of changed everything. So I don't really care about hearing about why this person was off in this way. Like, I don't have time for that. Just give me, where are we right now? What do we know right now is my general attitude. And I have tried to like break myself of that, but I really enjoyed the history that you put forth because it really, with math, it does feel a little bit more linear with math. I mean, yeah, there's been revolutions and everything, but you can, the way that you have it spelled out in your book, you can really see those steps. This led to this step. And I think that's something that I just always loved about math generally. It was the only subject I ever liked in school. And I loved it because you could show your work, and it didn't really matter who you were or anything else. And it didn't, you got the answer right or you didn't, and you could break down how you got there. And I really liked that. But do you have any? Yeah.
Well, you're going to love the last 3/8 of the book. I can tell you that much, because that, you're, in some sense, you've anticipated the big finish. Something I talk about at the very end of the book, which is this fact about math and especially about geometry. What makes it special for kids taking it in school is that it is that one place where you can make knowledge yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You're not dependent on anybody to tell you. You're not dependent on the history teacher or the history book to tell you what did or did not happen to these people at this time that's in the distant past that you can't access. You're not dependent on the English teacher to tell you, what this story means or like who the people in it are. Right. You make it yourself. And it's not because the teacher tells you that the triangle looks a certain way or the two lines are parallel. It's because you can work out step by step that they are. And that's potentially very powerful. Look, I'm not going to say that like every student's experience in every classroom lives up to that. That's the ideal. But the mere fact that it's possible, I think makes it very special. So, I write in that part of the book about how like in many times in history, geometry was seen as quite threatening because it was a source of authority and a source of knowledge that was not controlled by the people who wanted to be the
Yeah.
only source of authority and the only source. Um,
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I say that quite a bit with because there's still especially this is I've noticed this all along the way, but it's there's lots more talk of science in the public going on ever since COVID, and there's a lot of kind of people questioning it and everything, and you hear a lot of people kind of make the say like, well, science doesn't know everything, and therefore my perspective is like, whoa. Science isn't saying that it knows everything, and just because science knows this like what's within these margins, and then there's an infinite amount of stuff outside of that science doesn't know yet, that doesn't mean that's your territory. that doesn't mean because science hasn't exactly figured it out precisely that you have a better answer than it. And there does seem like this kind of knowledge is this very territorial sort of thing in many ways.
yeah, and one wishes it didn't have to be that way, but humans are humans, right? We're sort of like we like to sort of try to stake out territory. It sort of comes very easily and naturally to us, but in an ideal world, I think people would be looking at what we've gone through over the last year and looking at the changing state of our knowledge and being like, okay, so I can see science happening in real time. I can see us going from knowing less to knowing more. And that's sort of like not a matter of like playing gotcha, right? In science, like,
Yeah.
you're not ashamed to be wrong about stuff. If you're never wrong about stuff, you're not asking hard enough questions, right? You should be wrong a lot and then sort of steadily like sort of shave off your ignorance a little bit. But every one of us is going to go to the end of our days. We're going to lie down and die, like not understanding a lot more than we do understand. That's a given.
Right.
That is how it's going to be.
Right.
But there's such a thing as progress. I mean, I'm old fashioned enough to believe in that.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of the history and how things kind of led to next steps, and I mean, what incredible basically did you have all of the mosquito stuff? Did you do that before? How long have you been writing this book for, by the way? When did you start writing it?
I started writing it, I guess, in 2019. Like, I think I contracted for it in the early 2019. But to be honest, I probably wrote most of it last year. I wrote most of it over the course of 2020, most of the pages you see.
Okay, so yeah, all right, because it's just great that you have this you have this history of pandemics and how geometry has been used to figure out what to do with in terms of like how many mosquitoes if we need to get rid of in a region, how many pools you need to drain in what regions and how far away, and how mathematicians have played a role in figuring out disease spread through history and then applying it to some of COVID as well.
Right. And it's amazing how it all connects. This sort of idea of the random walk that was sort of first developed in this context of like malaria control by Ronald Ross, who was the guy who discovered the mosquitoes were spreading malaria. He also was kind of a wannabe mathematician. Like he was this incredible doctor who won the Nobel Prize in medicine, but he really wanted to be a mathematician or a poet. Those are two things that he cared about more than he cared about medicine, which was, again, we're sort of coming back to this issue of like, you're very successful in a field, and is that satisfying, or is there sort of something else you truly want to do? I mean, it's funny, you said it's cool how it's all linear and like one thing leads to the next and one thing leads to the next. But I got to be honest, my experience writing this book, first of all, as a writer, I never write the book I plan to write. I don't know if you're the same with the kind of work that you do, but like I write an outline and I pitch it to the publishing house and I'm like, this is what I'm going to do. And then when I actually sort of start getting into it, you find these connections and you sort of find this something else. This is a path, and you sort of follow that path. And then you end up going in a completely different place.
Yeah.
It's much more interesting to learn stuff and write about what you're learning than to write about stuff you already know. So I don't know if you can see it.
I bet that is a trap that you get into, right? You must.
Right. So I learned a lot. I didn't know there was
Yeah.
going to be anything about pandemics in this book, obviously, because a lot of us got a lot more interested in it rather suddenly. But it's incredible.
Man. You weaved just such an incredible narrative all through at least the first 5/8 that I've read.
Right.
Maybe it all falls apart in the last 3/8 of the book. I can't speak
it's a complete disaster. It's actually, there's not even complete sentences. It's mostly just like strings of syllables that are, I got a little tired, I was nearing the deadline. So I just started typing ASDF, No, I mean, but this, I don't know if you can see, can you sort of hold up the sort of frontispiece of the book? Like the very beginning, there's this map.
Oh,
I think that's in the galley, right? Since we're on video, I want to take advantage.
Yeah, might as well. Let me.
So this was like, because that thing that you're showing right now.
This?
Yeah, exactly. So this was like my map I made for myself of my own mind, all the different topics in the book. That's not even all of them. That's like a selection of topics and how they're all interrelated with each other. Because even for me, it was like hard to keep straight. It's very nonlinear in a way. That there's all these incredible connections between.
I missed this part. This is amazing. So this was your mind map that you made when you were planning out the book?
Well,
kind of.
That was what was in my mind, but I couldn't really draw that until I'd written a lot more and understood where the connections were. I mean, I think I knew about many fewer of those connections. And then when you start writing, you find these connections that you didn't even know were there. So I think of that as like, do you read fantasy novels?
I don't actually. I read nothing but science books ever.
Okay, so I will say, if you do read fantasy novels for your listeners who like read Lord of the Rings or whatever, this is supposed to be like the the map of the fantasy land that's like at the beginning of the book, where it's like, okay, the dragons live over here and the talking wolves live over there, and here's some scary mountains and stuff like that. I have
seen that. That's the one fantasy thing I've ever seen.
That's sort of how I think of it as being. But yeah, so it's very nonlinear in a way. It's this kind of crazy like neural connection of like all these different things, and that's very much the nature of geometry and the nature of math, that like things that appear different are connected under the skin. There's some structural similarity that joins them. This is like one of the main figures in the book is this guy Henri Poincaré, who was this fantastic geometer of the early part of the 20th century. And besides being a great mathematician, he was like a great slogan writer. He could have been a great copywriter, if he lived in like modern era. So he said mathematics is the art of giving the same name to different things. And that's very much like an animating spirit of the book, that there's things which may look different from each other on the surface, but under the skin, there's something connecting them, in the same way that the kind of thoughts that Ronald Ross was having as he tried to understand malaria transmission were the same kind of thoughts that Einstein was having when he was trying to understand Brownian motion and how particles move in a fluid, were the same as the thoughts that Louis Bachelier was having as he tried to be the first person to actually use math to understand the stock market, which at the time in France, by the way, was completely disreputable. They were like, I guess this is good, but that's not what math is about. Math is about like the heavenly bodies. It's not about like dirty, grubby people buying and selling stuff in the market. You know what I mean? I mean, times have changed, right?
Right. Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I've been the Brownian motion thing. I've been like as things start as more people get vaccinated and I start seeing more friends again and stuff, I'm definitely gonna wait till if I see something like some particles floating around on my glass. That's one I'm keeping in the old back pocket to whip out to really impress people. So I love making all the this related to this kind of a thing. Like that's what I love so much about aspects of evolution. I just went on a podcast and I did this whole like long thing about hummingbirds, and and a couple of people wrote me and they're like, how do you know so much about hummingbirds? I'm like, oh, I don't know hardly anything about hummingbirds. It was just an example that like you apply all these same kind of basic principles that apply to all birds and all living organisms on Earth, and math works in that same way.
Yeah, and you talk about the history. I'll say this, talking about these historical figures, one reason I do it is, as a teacher, I think to be a good teacher, you have to be able to put yourself into the mind of somebody who doesn't already understand the thing you're trying to explain. Right? It's fundamentally like an act of empathy to be able to do it. And doing this historical stuff is exactly like that, because every single mathematical concept we have, it wasn't like invented to be in a textbook. It was invented by people to solve a problem. And so when you go back into the history, you are putting yourself into the mind and into these lives of the people who did not understand things that we understand now. And I think, the thing you're reacting to, where you're like, sometimes I read a book and I read this historical stuff and I'm like, who cares? They were just wrong about stuff. I think I think that book is doing it the wrong way. I think if you write about people who are dead, people from the past, to be like, look how dumb they were, that's boring. Like, who cares, right? Then why read what they say? You should be looking to the past and being like, look how smart people were.
Yeah,
like, look how people have moved from not understanding.
Oh, no, it usually is. It's usually written like that. This is me. It's a very, very unpopular opinion that I have, where I like to mock the very sacred philosophers of the past. But
I wish I'd gotten to do Darwin, by the way. Darwin was one of the things, of course, the downside of writing about a lot of stuff and learning about a lot of stuff you didn't know you were going to write about was that there's stuff you planned to do that you didn't do. So Darwin's, I don't think his name is even in this book, but of course, the tree of life, there's a lot about the geometry of trees. And that's something that Darwin thought about a ton.
Yeah.
He didn't make it in.
Could you talk about the mosquitoes spread in relation to the drunken walk, in relation to malaria, and the kind of the calculating of how far a mosquito can travel in a given? I thought that was really eye-opening.
Yeah, absolutely, because it is again sort of unexpectedly to me, like sort of so relevant to what we're thinking about now as we think about sort of like coming out of COVID world. That so again, Ronald Ross, world famous doctor, the conqueror of malaria, the understander of the Anopheles mosquito. Of course, once you understand how the disease spreads, that gives you information about how to mitigate it, right? How to sort of like lessen its effect. And here's the problem, right? You might say, oh, great. So we know that the mosquito carries it. Get rid of all the mosquitoes. Okay, that's really hard. like you can't really like take like an entire country and kill every mosquito in it. That's like that was not feasible in 1900 when Ross was thinking about this, and it's not feasible now. So on the other hand, you can do a pretty good job of like clearing out most or all of the mosquitoes like from a region, like some well-defined with some work, you sort of like maybe find some sort of circle a mile wide and get all the mosquitoes out of there. And then Ross was asked, well, is this actually a good idea? Because if the mosquitoes are all going to be back a week later, probably wasn't worth like the amount of money and energy you spent clearing this entire region. So this was the question, like how quickly do mosquitoes spread? And the math that he came to, how would you figure that out? Well, you can figure out how quickly a mosquito can fly. I suppose they knew enough about mosquitoes to understand that. So you can say, oh, maybe a mosquito can fly a mile in a day. Then in 10 days, a mosquito could fly 10 miles. It'd cover a lot of ground. But here's the key insight that Ross had, is that mosquitoes don't just set a course and like fly in the same direction every day. Mosquitoes don't plan, right? That's just not how they are. And so he said, well, more realistically, yes, mosquitoes could like spread out really, really, really fast and like reoccupy the territory you cleared them from like really quickly if they made that their mission. But because mosquitoes don't have a mission, because they just flit around randomly, maybe this day they go this way, this day they go that way. In practice, how far are they likely to go? Not how far could they go, but how far are they likely to go? He made the problem probabilistic. And that was the problem he was thinking about. And he understood that it was like a math problem in the end. He understood that he didn't quite have the equipment to solve that problem himself. So he sent it to Carl Pearson, who was like a very famous statistician at the time. And then Carl Pearson kind of put the question in Nature, which was kind of like the math New York Times at the time, still is. It was like a little letters column where you're like, I have a question I'm working up. Of course, he didn't mention Ross in it. He completely like hid the guy who actually asked him the question and sort of posed that as if it was his own question, which annoyed Ronald Ross. But in the end, it turned out that this notion of the random walk that Ross was trying to invent, it's one of those things where you feel like sometimes the world is ready for a certain idea. Like this is in 1905, I'm talking right now. this is exactly the same time as Einstein is developing this idea in physics. And then, bizarrely enough, and this was a story I utterly did not know until I started writing the book, it's being developed in Russia at the same time as a way to win this kind of like crazy math battle between like the sort of like hardcore, ultra conservative, like Russian Orthodox Church people and like the sort of angry atheist people. They were both there in the math community. They hated each other. And they were essentially having a theological argument about the existence of free will, which bizarrely enough was like settled by the invention of the random walk in Russia. We now often call it a Markov chain after Markov, the Russian who was the atheist, by the way. The atheist won this battle in this particular case.
So free will.
Free will. Heavy.
It's so but mathematically, where do mathematicians usually come down now?
I think, look, mathematicians run the gamut in their philosophy, their temperament, their attitude towards life. So I think I'm safe in saying that probably most mathematicians would say this is a matter about which math is silent. We're not, we don't think math has the answers to. We like to think that maybe probably in most questions there's like a little bit of math in them. There's probably no questions in the real world which are completely unmathematical, but there's also not that many questions in the real world which are completely mathematical and that math can just settle.
Yeah, I don't. Let's see. I like a lot of like deterministic ideas, but I don't know. Free will's an interesting one.
Poincaré, another great quote from Poincaré. I won't be able to quote it exactly, but in the book, there's certainly mathematicians think a lot about like, is there an ultimate answer that God knows to like all these mathematical questions? And that's a question. And Poincaré kind of had like a funny answer to this. He's like, even if God did know the answer to all mathematical questions and he just like appeared and told us, we wouldn't really be able to follow it. We probably wouldn't understand it. So like, what does it matter? Basically, he's like, that's not even a question that we need to know because whether or not God does know the answer to all mathematical questions, like we wouldn't be able to comprehend.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the things that we care about. I think it's interesting that we even care about free will at all, because it's something that people ask me about quite a bit, and because people like if you were like, hey, do you want free will, and anyone would be like, yep, sign me up for the free will section, but you actually don't want to be thinking about everything all the day. You don't want to be choosing what amount of blood is flowing through your veins. You want this nifty bifurcation process that has distributed things nice and easy for you, so you aren't sitting there consciously choosing which direction the blood goes and everything else. So it's kind of interesting, the domains that we do seem to care a lot about it, and other aspects we're like, hey, surprise me, take me somewhere. You relinquish control in a lot of ways.
And look, if you think about it in terms of our interactions with these machines that can play a game like chess or Go or checkers. I read a lot about checkers in this book, or machines that produce imitations of language or what have you. It's very natural to like talk about what is the machine trying to do or what does the machine want, right? It's very natural for us to use that free will language, even though the machine is undertaking a deterministic process. And I'm not going to police that. I feel like people use those words and describe them because they feel right to us. And I'm not so worried about whether the machine really wants something or is trying to do anything. Yeah. I just know that, those words, that language makes it easier for humans to understand what's going on and like what the machine is doing. So why shouldn't we use them?
Yeah, that's interesting. We do tend to overassign agency to
I don't know.
things.
Do you think hummingbirds want to do things? Do you think that makes sense in talking about hummingbirds?
Yeah, I think that they have wants and desires in a lot of ways, which are just more kind of evolutionary drives, and I think that they have Well, that's it. I mean, it's a good question, but yeah, I mean, absolutely hummingbirds. I think you'd have to go smaller and smaller of a brain for me to be like, oh, does that thing have wants and desire? Like I was talking about sea squirts recently, which have a nervous system when they're born. They're like tadpoles swimming around, and they have a spine and a tail and eyeballs, and they navigate around to find the exact area where they're going to plop for life, and then they attach themselves, and then they're never going to move again. They're just a filter, and then they digest their own brain and eyes and spine because they no longer need those things. And I would say that I think the tadpole version does in a sense have needs and wants and desires, and the digested nervous system version does not.
Wow. Well, what do you think about this? So just to sort of bring in another topic that appears in this book, I mean, would you say like the people of the United States, like as a body, does the electorate have wants and needs, and does it try to do things, and does it make decisions like the people of a state or the people of a country? Because we certainly treat them as if we do, right? We talk about the popular will, and another big chunk of this book is about this kind of crazy system by which we draw legislative districts and try to sort of translate and try to sort of generate laws in a way that we say is doing what the public wants. Well, what does that even mean?
Right.
And I can tell you, it gets real ugly. It gets real dirty, and it gets real ugly. So
yeah, the kind of assigning of a personality to a region, and then we're saying this is a representative. This person is representing the views of the. But isn't that kind of meant to represent the mean of something? Even there, that's like, I mean, our own minds have a lot of competing interests and desires all the time between right. I'm a son. I'm a friend. I'm a interviewer. I wear many hats, and I need to eat, and there's sex drive, and there's disease avoidance, and there's all these competing things.
Those two in particular have been in tension for a lot of people over the last year, right? Those last two.
Yeah.
No, but I can even, I mean, it's great because just as we're talking here, I can like see you doing math in your eyes, right? I can see that as you start to think about it, you're like, wait, there's a real question here. And I can see the math starting to happen as a teacher. Like, that's what I'm always looking for, right? Because this question of like, what do we even mean when we say represent? Yeah. That's not a math question, but it's not a math question. The math is wound. And when you start talking about, is it like a mean or an average or something like that, you're unavoidably getting into that mathematical language. And so, it's a very hard, knotty political problem with math wound up in it. And so, one of the things I write about in the end of the book is the long and kind of sordid history of sort of like mathematical manipulation of outcomes. Then I do this stuff about fighting authority at the very end. You got to kind of get real dirty right before the end, and then you have something uplifting at the end. You want people to walk out of the play like singing the happy song, right?
Yeah. I don't know. I like a good tragedy at the end. I like a good sinking feeling once in a while. Very few people go for it.
So you like King Lear. I like the ones where they all get married at the end and they sing.
Yeah, I could tell. You're a more jovial person than I am. But yeah, that's interesting. I mean, as we're talking about this, I'm kind of thinking about psychological heuristics being very similar to these local optima and these where it's, when we're talking about a representative, a heuristic is this rule of thumb that is representing this probabilistic outcome in a way where you're saying, if you do this in this situation, it will work to your benefit 65% of the time or something like that. So there's a cost involved there, but
that's a really interesting metaphor, right? I mean, I hadn't really thought of that, but right, sort of a mental heuristic you use acting as a proxy for some much, much, much more complex thing that you're not going to be able to deal with directly, in the same way that in theory, the person who's in the state house on your behalf is a proxy for this incredibly complex thing that's not just you, but the other however many thousand people in your district who are purportedly represented by that person, right? And like as with any heuristic, you notice it when it doesn't work.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Well,
that's
hopefully, not
right.
always. Hopefully you
right.
notice it. Yeah.
Right, but actually, I'm just going to push this metaphor a little harder,
Yeah.
right? Because the danger is, and I think you must know this well for thinking about heuristics, is that you start to mistake the heuristic for the real thing.
Yeah.
Right, you sort of start to forget that it was supposed to be a stand-in for something. And in the same way, right, you don't want to make the mistake of thinking about what some group of people in the state house decided as being identical with what, in some sense, the people actually decided. No, it's just a proxy for that. It's just a heuristic. It's just a stand-in. You better never forget that.
Right. Interesting. Have you seen Westworld by chance?
I did, and I have no idea where you're going with this. And now I'm very interested.
It's just they talk a lot about AI and heuristics and what might happen. I mean, it's. I'm curious what you have to say about. I mean, you must get the question a lot of like, are the robots going to take over? You do AI. That's the like a go-to question you hear a lot of people make. And you had this lovely quote in the book, which was something to the effect of, don't be scared of math, basically. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, look, like we just said about like, King Lear versus a comedy, like I do tend to bright side things. So like, but in particular, I feel like, and this comes back to this question of like different kinds of tasks are more or less difficult for different kinds of minds. The fact that a machine can play Go much better than a human, or chess or checkers or something like that, that's a particular kind of task that machines are very well suited to do. I don't think you should look at that and say, well, that just means that computers are smarter than us. That just means that like in 5 years, the computers will be able to do everything we do and much better. I'm not saying that's impossible, by the way, but I'm saying that is not determined by the fact that they're very good at tasks that are exactly suited to their skills, right? I mean, they still have problems driving a car, as you know very well. Although you could argue that in some contexts, they're better at driving a car than a person, and in some contexts, they're worse. That's one where I think that there's sort of different metrics on which you could say one is better than the other. And there are also sort of very basic tasks. Famously, a machine can't fold a shirt. Did you know that? You basically something that is like incredibly easy for like a 15-year-old who works at the mall. Like you cannot, the most expensive robot in the world.
It can't fold a shirt? Really? A machine just can't fold? It's just impossible.
That's what I've read. We should look it up, but that's not in the book. I haven't researched it, but I mean, but the point is, it's very plausible that there's things
yeah.
But that said, obviously, what I know best is mathematics, and I think the sort of relationship between machines and humans and mathematics is fascinating. And I do think that even just the basics of like calculators and computers have already changed how we do math. We sort of use them as our assistants, and I think maybe what I think is most likely is that they'll be upgraded from assistants to partners, not superseding us. But, one thing I say in the book, just talking about this relationship between trying to train machines to sort of, in some sense, think mathematically, although not in the same way that we do, is that, you might start by saying like, wow, our machine's going to figure out all the answers. And I'm like, no, that's not an ambitious enough goal. The machines should be asking good questions. That's what we really need them for. I mean, that's a much bigger goal than giving all the answers.
I love that. It set me off on just imagining some beautiful future where you just sit there and have and go on an app and the AI just asks you these incredibly fascinating questions that no one's ever thought to ask before. That would be
exactly.
That would be incredible. Yeah, it is funny that to me it's always seemed a little funny to be scared of AI, at least just yet. But the idea of like you said, getting really good at chess, like, oh, now they're going to take over the world. Well, if I met a human that was really good at Sudoku, I wouldn't be like, I guess you should be king. like, it's such a weird, specific thing. or like if someone trained their dog to like walk on two legs, I wouldn't be like, stop training that dog. It's gonna take over. Next, it's gonna be tying a tie, and then what? Like it just seems like an odd at least for where we're at right now. I mean, I guess there could be some tipping point where all of a sudden AI is learning to reconstruct itself faster than doing all these things we can conceive, and even at that point, why would it be our enemy?
I would never say it's impossible. I would just say it's not. Like most actual things in the world, it's neither impossible nor inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Most things are like that.
I'm sorry, I'm like all over this place with this conversation, but you've just had me.
No, but look, you saw the picture at the beginning of the book. I mean, that's what the book is like, right? I mean, there's a story, there's a through line, but at the same time, there's like a lot of stuff in it, and there's a lot of connections between all the different things. This is
definitely what my brain is like all the time.
Exactly. So if you want your brain to look like that, then you should read this book. I don't even know if that's like good or bad from a marketing point of view. Like, I'm not sure. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I don't know.
You should definitely read this book. It's terrific. Could you actually talk a little bit about? Where I'm at right now? I had just gotten into. I think I'm in kind of the second chapter talking about COVID. I'm in the chapter
the cubic
chapter
model.
11,
I can see the cubic, right?
Yeah, the terrible law of increases is where I'm at. But would you mind talking a little bit about some of the? It doesn't necessarily need to be COVID, but just how a mathematician is trying to model and make predictions, and what happens when people are like, how did they said it was going to be this prediction, and then it was this, and now I don't know who to trust, and I liked breaking down. Can you break down some of like the basics of where the very simplest, because it was nice. I saw it kind of broken down in a pretty like manageable algebra equation. Like this is where you start with modeling a pandemic. Say two people are going to get it or are going to spread it for everyone that has it. So if that's over the course of 10 days, that means that a person with COVID is going to be spreading it to 0.2 people a day. And then you're kind of going from there. And I don't know how much in the weeds we should get into this, but I loved that it started with like, you can find this pretty simple model to like get a little bit of a picture, and then you just keep on adding more and more kind of complexity to it from there.
Right. I mean, a model is a piece of technology, right? And with any technology, as you develop it, you start simple, and then you kind of bolt on more pieces to give it more functionality, or to make it be able to operate in a wider range of circumstances. And, modeling the spread of a disease is no different. So just as you say, the basic idea is, think of it, it doesn't even have to be, right? I mean, you could say like, a secret and you tell it to two people. Now 3 people know it. And if the rule is that the secret is like really juicy and everybody who hears it tells it to 2 more people, then each of those 3 is going to tell it to 2 more people. So that's 6 new people who know it. And now there's 9. Then each of those 9 people is going to tell it to 2 more people. That's 18 more people, a total of 27. Each day, 3 times more people know the secret. And that's exponential growth, a so-called geometric progression. It always comes back down to geometry in the end, right? And that, I mean, and sometimes that's very simple, but that's the basic model for sharing secrets or for sharing diseases. I mean, in some sense, where does this come from? The same guy, Ronald Ross, something else I didn't know, the same malaria guy 10 years later. And because he's this sort of super ambitious guy, he didn't want to just develop a theory of pandemics. He wanted to develop a theory of what he called happenings. He's like, I want this to be general, like a physics of like all of human behavior. So, and he brought on a mathematician, Hilda Hudson. He knew he didn't know enough math to really do this by himself. So he kind of acquired.
I'm going to solve everything that there is. You know what? I should probably work with a mathematician too.
Exactly.
I should probably get one person to help me solve everything that there is.
So Ross and Hudson, yeah, they set up the beginnings of this model. And of course, there's something already that you have to take into account, because you could say, oh, great, simple. Every day, 3 times more people know the secret. That's called exponential growth. The problem is those numbers get like really big, really fast. And you're like, great, okay, according to my model, like 100 billion people know the secret in 30 days, whatever it may be. Well, that's more people than there are. So something has gone wrong. They tell a funny story in the book about someone sort of quite serious. This was around the time of 9/11. And somebody was like, according to my model, if an enemy released smallpox into the US, 77 trillion people could become infected like within a year. And it's like, okay, something's gone wrong, right? Because there aren't 77 trillion people.
Unless it makes you birth trillions of people that are infected.
Yes, that would be a hell of a smallpox attack. So, right. So then you have to put another piece onto the model, something to account for the fact that, the virus uses up susceptible people in the same way that the secret kind of uses up people who don't know it. I mean, the part you're about to read, here's the thing I found so cool. So I go back in history to the beginning of this way of thinking, which is like, so we're going back to the 1850s. It's like a cattle plague ravaging Europe called Rinderpest, which I had never heard of. It turns out it's the disease that jumped to humans and became measles. Actually, it was a cattle plague first that jumped species.
Humble beginnings.
Exactly, but basically, the first people to think about what the shape of a pandemic would look like and how it would rise and how it would fall. This was done before they even had the germ theory of disease. Like they had no idea how a disease would spread, or maybe they had ideas that were wrong, actually, even worse. And yet, this is sort of the power of math. They were able to sort of do pretty good inferences without understanding the underlying mechanism at all. In fact, he even raises a footnote. This is now I'm talking about William Farr, who was this kind of pioneering epidemiologist of the 1850s. Like he even kind of puts in a footnote, some people think that there's these little microscopic living beings that are like jumping from cow to cow and causing the disease. But like, I don't know, like nobody's ever seen one of those things. That seems like a little wild. I feel I should mention it in a footnote because some people say that, but nonetheless, despite not understanding this, he was actually able to have a pretty good understanding of, he was able to say, hey, this is actually near its peak at a time when the general conventional wisdom was this is rampaging out of control.
Yeah. So this is, I did have fun kind of reading this, this section. It was kind of breaking down the starting formula was if you take the number of infected people today, and then you add 0.2, which is the average of how many people someone's infecting a day, times the number today, times times the number of susceptible people divided by 1 million. And then I'll put this in the description so people can just see it and look at it a little bit better. But minus 0.1 time. So then it's minus 0.1 because if each person is having it for 10 days, that means that there's people each day. 0.1 people basically times the number of people that have it are no longer infected and are immune, at least in a simplified, we're not talking about mutations and everything way.
Right.
And that's how you're kind of calculating. And then you just kind of put that in, and that's how you can calculate what numbers might look like tomorrow and start charting these graphs. And then but as I saw that, which is like, for the average person, I think if they saw this, it would take maybe a little bit of time to explain. And I think that they would be able to get it. I didn't explain it very well just now, but I think they would be able to get it. But then when you throw in like, okay, now what happens when you have a mutation? And it seems some people are immune to it sometimes and others aren't. And there's this rate of reinfection, and it just seems like such an insane mathematical issue to figure out as you just keep on adding more and more of those variables.
Yeah, it is. And, that's why we don't have a crystal ball about this stuff. I mean, by the way, let me just say, I mean, I always try to write in such a way that I always say the stuff I write, you can read it with a pencil in your hand or you can read it without a pencil in your hand. Because I know that different people approach this stuff in different ways. What I never want to do is write a book that's about math, but the math is not there. I like to put some of it actually in so that if you want to really engage with it and get in there and like write stuff on a piece of scratch paper, you can do it. But also you're never that far from the story, right?
Yeah,
There's never,
yeah.
like, I try to sort of, I want the book to work if you want to read it casually, or if you want to read it, hey, I'm going to like follow this with a pencil and like do some of these computations by myself. I want it to really be there on the page.
Yeah, I hope I didn't intimidate any listeners with that poor reading of that formula, but when it's broken out and this is like such a small section of the book, like you said, you put a few of these things in here and there, and a lot of it's
but
about
I like
the
them
story.
In there, yeah.
But yeah.
But the one thing I compare it to in the book, I mean, you're absolutely right that we don't have a crystal ball and we can't just by math predict the future of COVID or any other pandemic. I sort of compare it to like a tennis game. Like you can do physics and sort of estimate like the flight of a tennis ball pretty well. It's pretty easy to say like what happens if you throw it up in the air. If you hit it with like some amount of, that's harder, but you can sort of still do it by physics. But that doesn't mean that you can tell who's going to win a tennis match by physics, right? Because what the players actually do affects what happens, just like what we do and the choices people make, both collectively and individually, affect the course of a pandemic. Nonetheless, if you were going to try to analyze tennis, the physics would be where you started, right? If you're a tennis player, you do kind of want to have some sense of, if I slice the ball a certain way, like how's it going to go? So I think that's really the right way to think of it. The model's not a crystal ball. It doesn't tell you the future, but it does kind of establish the basic mechanisms where you can make some kind of guesses about, if I do this, what might happen. You know what I mean? Like nothing is certain, but it sort of tells you, just like the physics of a tennis ball, the basic thing that you're affecting when you take some human action.
Yeah. Has there been any moments during COVID where, as a mathematician, there's been things that have just been incredibly stimulating? I've talked with virologists that, as tragic and everything as COVID is, there's people that there's virologists that have almost like a reverence for, or like are impressed by like learning about what it's doing. They're like, wow, this is so interesting. Of course, no one wishes that it was doing that thing, but learning about how it's interacting and spreading and everything. And they're like, this is such an impressive virus. Have you had anything that like that as a mathematician where you've had to kind of, where you found yourself thinking about all of these numbers of variables and like, oh, how would you go about calculating something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see it on my blog in real time if you want to see, like, as I was sort of wrestling with some of these ideas, like from like last, like April and May, sort of thinking about all these kind of competing ideas about what we could expect and what was going, when we knew much less about how transmission worked. What can you do besides look at data that you have and try to figure out what's going on under the hood where we can't see? I think what I think is, when there's a crisis situation like that, it's human to want to feel useful, right? So whatever expertise it is that you have, you can't help wanting to feel, well, let me try to bring that to bear somehow. How can I be useful in this situation in which, so obviously people who know how to make vaccines, they were the really useful people, right? Like way more than the mathematicians. But I mean, everybody, I think, like people who were like gifted storytellers were like out there telling stories to people and telling stories of the pandemic. Like people who are, how can you not, right? How can you not be in a situation like that and say, like, is there some way I can do something for somebody, as indirect as it may be? And so I think, as you say, scientists, I think, very much felt that and were like, let me put down this other thing I was thinking about and think about this. Like, how could you not?
Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. This will get some of my listeners perked up a little bit. You saw some or I saw in the intro you mentioned you mentioned that during ayahuasca experiences, people see geometry during some of these experiences, and I haven't read your whole book, but you talk a bit about information and consciousness toward the end, and I was curious if because I was do you get into fractals or anything like that later on in the book?
I only glance off it. It's like one of the many things that would be great to talk about. And I glance off it when I talk about the kind of complicated question of how you measure the perimeter of like a state or a district, because that's very related to fractal geometry.
Well, the reason why I bring it up was because I've had some psychedelic experiences myself. I've seen fractal like.
Wait, have you taken ayahuasca? Did you have this? Because I was reading. I'm going to be honest with you. I read about this experience. This thing I read about and reported about.
Oh yeah, yeah. I've done ayahuasca a couple times, but I've smoked DMT a lot of times.
And did you have these kind of geometric visions? I'm super curious. Actually.
I have a lot of ideas about them. So a lot of people that have.
I don't even know what DMT is, by the way. I'm just going to be completely straight with you. I did not know what that is.
It's dimethyltryptamine. It's the active ingredient in ayahuasca. So if you smoke it, it's actually like a concentrate of ayahuasca. So it's an exceedingly intense experience that is, it comes on exceptionally fast, and it's very, very, very powerful, and way more jarring than ayahuasca, which is one of the more out there kind of experiences that you can have. So take that times about 100, but it's a very brief amount of time. It's like 5 minutes. It can feel like lifetimes. Like it can feel like 1,000 years really easily. And a lot of people think that you're seeing these kind of different worlds, because that's what, if you were in the experience, just subjectively reporting what it seemed like and felt like, and it would seem like just a completely parallel universe or multiverse, and sometimes there's beings there and everything else. Well, I've always kind of had what I've liked about it is that I have, my take is that you're seeing kind of like a multiverse of perception inside of your mind. You're seeing some of the emergent properties of perception and consciousness, like a different layer. Like if you were to make a picture, you start with the line, and then maybe you put some coloring in, and then some shading, and your brain's kind of doing the same thing, this kind of layered approach of stacking, and then adding like a dimension, and adding all these different things that emerge into this fantastic fluid interface we call consciousness. But kind of the bare bones of it is a little more simplified. And so you see there's all these fractals and things that happen within it. And I always kind of, so I guess my take, I'm actually sort of known for having like a grounded take on these experiences, which is that I think that it's something that it's a window into our minds, basically. And I know some neuroscientists that have told me off the air that are like, oh yeah, I was going to be in marketing. I smoked DMT as an undergrad, and that's why I'm a neuroscientist. And now it changed the shape of things. But I love the idea that DMT is robbing us of some of our most talented marketers. That, like, who knows how much better marketing would be if all the future marketers hadn't smoked DMT and went into neuroscience instead. And I'm always like, I'm always skittish about getting into a drug conversation with any of my guests or whatever. But there are, I mean, one thing that's definitely universal. If you smoke enough DMT, you are going to see a lot of fractals, lots and lots and lots of fractals. And I thought that what would be interesting is considering that fractals, like a coach snowflake or something like that, which is this interesting way of kind of, in a way, you're able to fit infinity inside of a finite space with kind of this recursive sort of a program. And I thought, what an interesting way that the brain could be putting together consciousness, or kind of delivering packets of information in like packing a lot of information into a small, like, deliverable little package.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, there's so much stuff there. Let me just connect it to something we talked about before, which is, remember I was saying that the most interesting thing in studying an artificial thinking or learning system is, what does it do when it's failing to do the thing that you think it's supposed to be doing, right? So if you think of your own human perceptual apparatus as what's its job supposed to be, seeing like what's in front of you, like out there in the physical world, like finding out if there's like a rock flying at your face or if there's like a jaguar running up behind you, you know what I mean? So
Right.
You're intentionally disrupting that. I mean, I think it's a perfect example of saying, like, how do you learn something about how the apparatus actually works? By giving it some stimulus, doing something to it, putting it in a context where it is kind of failing to do the thing that is its ostensible purpose, like telling you what's in the physical world right around you. And when it doesn't do that, what is it doing? That's how you can really learn something about how the machine works.
Yeah, and inhibiting certain processes and everything too. And so I don't know. I just thought I'd share that with you, just because I had read it in the beginning, and I didn't know how into fractals you were, or
well, I am. I taught about it this semester, actually, in my regular old class to people in Math 521. And actually, you know, the thing about talking about a book you've already written is that every conversation you have with an interesting person is like, oh, that would have made a good chapter, right? Because that I could have done. I could have talked about Cantor, who kind of creates the modern mathematical notion of infinity with these so-called Cantor sets that very much have this like recursive, infinite amount of information in a finite space, like kind of vibe, and who was at the time sort of like, people were like, is this guy a sort of mystic weirdo, or is this guy like a sort of great mathematician? It was pretty clearly recognized that what he was doing was mathematics and not mysticism. But yeah, all I can say is it's a direction I could have gone that would have been another great chapter in an already kind of thick book. But
yeah,
I'm glad we got to talk about it.
Yeah, you did it. You packed quite a bit of stuff in the already 253 pages that I have read. So we got another 150 to go. But yeah, this is really fantastic. And we're actually recording a little bit before it comes out, but this is out May 25th, right?
Yep, May 25th.
This is my birthday, by the way. So
happy birthday.
Yeah,
I mean, by the time everybody's hearing this, I will be wishing you happy birthday in the past.
Yeah. So people can, upon hearing this, you can now go on and check out Jordan Ellenberg's book, Shape, The Hidden Geometry of Information, Biology, Strategy, Democracy, and Everything Else. I feel like we shouldn't end with some drug tangent that isn't necessarily in the book. Do you have some stuff that you want? Oh, I have a great question for you. So I used to love math. I absolutely hated school for the reasons we already discussed.
Still do, to be honest.
I do. I really do. And it rekindled my my love a little bit reading your book. And I've thought many times that I got to get back into learning math again, because I used to, when I was a kid, I'd have like babysitters that were older than me, and I'd have them bring their math books over when they came and stuff. And I was learning algebra and stuff when I was in like 5th or 6th grade and everything. And I just loved, I would abandon all my other homework and do math problems. But if someone's, in school, you had textbooks that you'd arrive at in algebra 1, you'd get the algebra 1 textbook and you'd learn that, and then you'd go to algebra 2, then geometry and so on. If you wanted to get into math as an adult, where would be a good place to start?
Well, that's a great question. And I think what the answer is, um, a little bit depends on what your goals were and what you wanted to do. But just to sort of throw out, um, just I mean, I'm a book guy, so just to throw out some books that I know about that I think are really great. I think Steve Strogatz writes wonderful books. His most recent one is called Infinite Powers. He has another book called The Joy of X, and those are the ones I would recommend for like somebody touching on the math topics that are in school, but from a much like richer, more narrative, more historical, like more fun way. Like Infinite Powers is about calculus, right? It's like if you ever want to know, like, wait, why did people do this? Just to torture people on their AP exam? Like, no, like that's, and he really like tells the story. I think Eugenia Cheng's books are like really eccentric and interesting and weird, and she will talk about sort of like the kind of like higher level research math that she works on, but in connection with just like sort of how she sees everyday life through that lens. So sort of talking about like much more advanced and contemporary math. And then I think, for the side of, if your goal is to understand sort of stuff that's happening in the world right now, like a little bit less theoretical, more practical, like books by a very close friend of mine, Kathy O'Neill, called Weapons of Math Destruction, is like a wonderful and very popular book. That's sort of about the algorithms.
Such an adorable title.
Right?
I love it. Yeah.
What the stuff she writes about is unfortunately not so adorable, right? It's about kind of the algorithms to which we handed over like maybe a lot more authority than we ought to have. And by the way, not because they're like incredibly super intelligent robots who will dominate us, just because they're kind of like dumb and bad at what they do. I mean, one thing I learned from Kathy is that it's not the good algorithms we should be scared of, it's the crappy algorithms.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that really screw people over.
Well, didn't we in Hiroshima, wasn't that bomb like orders of magnitude larger than it was meant to be? There was actually even,
I don't know.
Yeah, there was a miscalculation on a certain metal that they used that they actually thought was going to lessen the blow. That's meant to just be like more of a warning or a flex, and there was like a U.S. Like surveillance plane and a ship like far off the coast, which was far from the distance projected mathematically from what the explosion would be, and it turned out to be it was much larger than it was ever meant to be because of a slight miscalculation of like, if you use this metal it will actually lessen the blow, and then it turned out it made it 5 times or some orders of magnitude larger than it was meant to be. And you worry about that with like algorithms or something. I
mean, just to say like a couple more things, because not everybody takes in information through books. There's a wonderful YouTube channel called Mathophile. So if your thing is like, I like to watch videos on YouTube, which I know is like a huge mechanism for learning, they just have like tons and tons of like very enjoyably like produced videos about that. That too is mostly about a mix of sort of more contemporary research topics and older stuff. And then just to kind of end on a historical note, there's a fellow called Martin Gardner, who I think most people would say is the great math popularizer. He died a few years ago, but he wrote a column in Scientific American. It must be for like 30 years. And I think every mathematician as a kid read these books of his columns. And the reason I bring that up last is because, when you say the way that many people kind of feel deadened by their experience kind of reading these dusty textbooks in math, I think, what's missing like content. No, that content is actually like really deep and good. Like algebra is actually like a great, wonderful subject. What's missing, I think, is this sense of play and this sense of fun that's so fundamental to the actual practice of mathematics. And certainly when I write, I try to kind of have that playful sense as I go, because I think that's not sort of some kind of like sugar coating you're putting over the real thing. That is the real thing. And I think Gardner, his column, am I remembering the time? I think it was called like Mathematical Recreations. And it's probably the best ever at sort of combining true mathematical depth with that spirit of play and that spirit of fun that in the end animates everything you want to do as a mathematician. So I feel like even though that stuff's old, it absolutely like holds up for any reader today.
What if you literally like, what if I was just like, I just want to because I often have this feeling that I want to do. I just want to start playing with some numbers and solving some equations and stuff. Are there any, like, I just want to go back through, like, burn through algebra 1, see when starts getting hard again, and work my way up to like calculus or something. Is there any good programs out there that you know of that you can just start going on and trying to do problems?
Sure. I mean, I would say for curricular stuff like that, I mean, I think like, everybody sort of says Khan Academy, like a cliche, but they say that because it's actually like really good. And those are like, I mean, our students definitely watch Khan Academy videos in conjunction with actually like going to class. And I think they really like them. I think those are really good. I think if you want to pay, there's a wonderful, wonderful group of courses from a website called Art of Problem Solving, which offers online courses, really starting from pre-algebra and like going all the way up through like well beyond calculus. Now, most of your fellow students are going to be kids. You got to accept that. So you got to have the ego strength to like not mind if like there's an 11-year-old in there with you who's picking it up a little faster than you. That might happen. Okay, so be it.
Well, that's the beauty of math, is it doesn't matter your age or your gender or race or whatever else. It's you do the work and you figure it out and you get the problem correct or you don't.
Yeah, and so their courses I think are like really good, really well designed, and again, they have that spirit of exploration that I think sometimes is hard to do in a kind of more like mass-produced context.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Jordan Ellenberg. And I'll have to I'll have to say hi next time I'm in Madison.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. Do you actually come here?
Yeah, well, I'm in La Crosse, Wisconsin at the moment, and
oh my God, I did not even know that.
I typically go through Madison. I mean, I usually am on the road, and I typically go through Madison. I recorded 2 of my 3 comedy albums at Comedy on State, and
oh, wow.
I typically go through Madison once or twice a year. So yeah, one of my favorite cities. So
yes, when it will be, the coffee shops are open again. We can sit outside and do whatever. It's great.
Sounds terrific. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. Check out Jordan's book, and we'll see you next week.